The woman's blade pierced the Alpha's chest before his entire army, and the ancient vampire, who had crushed kingdoms beneath his heel for 1,000 years, staggered backward, not from the wound, but from the impossibility of what had just occurred. Wait, before the next revelation happens. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or awakened powers, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. Blood, his blood, black as midnight oil, seeped between his fingers as Kaelin Drave, the Alpha of the Northern Covenant, stared at the mortal woman who stood before him in the throne room of his fortress. Behind him, 300 vampires stood frozen in collective shock. The blade had driven into him hadn't been silver, hadn't been blessed by any priest or witch. It was simple iron, the kind peasants used to till fields. But it was exactly where his heart would have been if that organ still functioned in the way mortal hearts did. "Impossible," Kaelin breathed, his voice a rumble that shook dust from the ancient stone rafters. His eyes, crimson, luminous, capable of compelling kings to their knees, fixed on the woman. She was small, her dress torn and muddy, her face gaunt from hunger. A refugee from the war-torn southern territories brought to him in chains only hours before. She didn't flinch under his gaze. That was her first crime. "You said strength is yours alone," the woman replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You told them," she gestured to the assembled vampires, "that no mortal could ever challenge you, that we exist only to feed you, to fear you, to bow." She twisted the blade, and Kaelin felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries: pain. "You lied." The throne room erupted in chaos. Vampires surged forward, fangs bared, ready to tear this insolent mortal to pieces. But Kaelin raised one hand, and they stopped as if hitting an invisible wall. "No," he said, his voice cutting through the clamor. "No one touches her." This command sparked even greater confusion. His second-in-command, a ruthless female vampire named Seraphine with hair like spilled ink, stepped forward. "My lord, she has assaulted you before the entire court. The law demands." "I make the law, Seraphine." Kaelin's eyes never left the mortal woman. "And I would know this creature's name before I decide her fate." The woman's jaw clenched. For a moment, Kaelin thought she might refuse to answer, which would have been delicious. Instead, she yanked the blade free. Kaelin grunted despite himself and let it clatter to the stone floor. "Elara Mirren," she said, "daughter of no one important, widow of a farmer, former slave to your southern vassals." Her dark eyes met his without wavering. "And the woman who just proved you bleed like anything else." The wound in Kaelin's chest was already closing, the supernatural regeneration of his kind knitting flesh and bone back together. But the echo of pain lingered, and with it something far more dangerous: fascination. He had existed for over a millennium, had watched empires rise and crumble, had turned princes and pauper the like into his immortal servants. Strength, he had always believed, resided in power alone. The power to dominate, to control, to inspire such terror that even thinking of resistance became impossible. Yet this woman, with nothing but a crude blade and audacity, had struck him, had drawn his blood, had made him feel. "Take her to the eastern chamber," Kaelin commanded, descending from his throne. The wound had sealed completely now. leaving only a tear in his black silk shirt and the stain of his own blood. "Post guards, she is not to be harmed." "My lord," Seraphine began. "Do you question me?" Kaelin's voice dropped to a whisper, which was far more terrifying than any shout. Seraphine bowed her head immediately. "Never, my lord." "Good." He turned to Elara, who stood with her shoulders back despite being surrounded by creatures that could end her life in a heartbeat. "You and I, Elara Mirin, are going to have a very long conversation. But first, I think you've earned a meal. Something other than the scraps they fed you in the cages." "I don't want your charity," Elara said. "It's not charity." Kaelin smiled, revealing just the tips of his fangs. "I prefer my conversational partners to be conscious. Starvation makes for poor dialogue." Two guards moved to flank Elara, and though she tensed, she didn't resist as they escorted her from the throne room. Kaelin watched her go, noting the slight limp in her left leg, the way she held her ribs as if they pained her. She'd been beaten recently. Probably in the southern territories, where his vassals ruled with even less mercy than he did. When the doors closed behind her, Seraphine approached him again, her expression carefully neutral. "You're making a mistake, my lord. The others are already talking. A mortal struck you and drew blood. If you don't make an example of her, then what?" Kaelin interrupted, turning to face his assembled court. 300 vampires, each one pledged to him, each one bound by blood oaths that predated most human nations. Will they think me weak? Will they believe that because a desperate woman with a piece of iron managed to wound me, I am somehow diminished? He let the question hang in the air, then threw back his head and laughed. The sound was rich, genuine, and utterly without humor. "Let them think what they wish," he said. "But mark this, that woman did something none of you have done in centuries. She surprised me. She showed courage when courage should have been impossible." He walked toward the throne's dais, his boots echoing on stone. "There is a lesson in that, one I intend to understand." "And if understanding her leads to more mortals believing they can resist us?" another vampire called out, Lord Drasko, one of the oldest of his covenant. "Then we will remind them why fear exists," Kaelin replied smoothly. "But not today. Today I am curious, and my curiosity, as you all know, is sacred." He dismissed the court with a wave of his hand, and they filed out in groups, whispering among themselves. Seraphine lingered, her eyes searching his face for something she clearly couldn't find. "What is it?" he asked. "I've known you for 200 years, my lord. I've never seen you spare someone who attacked you." "Then perhaps you don't know me as well as you think." Kaelin touched the hole in his shirt where Elara's blade had pierced him. "Prepare the eastern chamber. I want her comfortable. And find out everything about her. Where she came from, what happened to her family, why she was brought here." "As you command." Seraphine bowed and departed, leaving Kaelin alone in the vast throne room. He sat on his throne, carved from a single piece of black marble 1,000 years ago, and considered the evening's events. In truth, Elara Mirin had not been the first mortal to attack him. Assassination attempts came regularly, usually from hunters or zealots convinced that killing him would free humanity from the vampire scourge. They all failed, of course. Silver burned, but didn't kill. Holy water was superstition. Sunlight weakened, but didn't destroy. Not one of his age and power. Fire could do it, if sustained long enough, but getting close enough to immolate him was virtually impossible. No, what made Elara different wasn't the weapon or even the wound. It was the look in her eyes when she struck. Not hatred, Not madness, but something quieter and more dangerous. Certainty. She had believed in that moment that she could hurt him. And she'd been right. Kalen closed his eyes and allowed himself to feel the memory of that pain. It had been exquisite. Brief, yes, and meaningless in the grand scheme of his immortal existence, but real, genuine, a reminder that beneath all his power, something resembling vulnerability still existed. Dangerous thinking, that. Vulnerability was for mortals, for the weak. He had spent centuries purging such weaknesses from himself and his covenant. Strength, he'd always taught, was the only truth that mattered. The strong survived. The strong ruled. The strong shaped the world to their will. Yet, Ilara Mirin, with no strength to speak of, had shaped his evening in a way no amount of power could have predicted. "Interesting," he murmured to the empty room. The eastern chamber was not a cell, which surprised Ilara more than anything else that had happened. She'd expected a dungeon, chains, perhaps torture instruments. Instead, she found herself in a room that, while austere, contained actual furniture. A bed with clean linens, a table with a chair, a basin of water that appeared fresh. The walls were stone, but tapestries depicting ancient battles softened their cold surfaces. The guards had left her alone after depositing her inside. She heard the lock click, confirming she was still a prisoner, but the accommodations suggested she was a prisoner of some value. Or a prisoner who'd soon be executed in some elaborate fashion. Ilara sank onto the bed, her body finally acknowledging the cumulative exhaustion of the past weeks. She'd lost track of the days since her village burned. Since the raiders came, vampires serving the Northern Alpha, though they hadn't mentioned their master's name until later. Since they'd killed her husband, her neighbors, everyone too old or young to be of use. Since they'd put her in chains and marched her north with 100 other survivors. Most of that 100 were dead now, worked to death in the fields, or bled dry for food. Ilara had survived through a combination of luck and willingness to do whatever necessary. When the overseers wanted labor, she labored until her hands bled. When they wanted submission, she submitted. And when they finally decided to send a tribute of slaves to the Alpha himself, she'd been included in that shipment. All the while, she'd been planning. The knife had come from a careless guard at a way station. The opportunity had come in the throne room, when the Alpha commanded she approach him. The courage, well, that had come from having nothing left to lose. She'd expected to die the moment the blade struck home. Instead, the impossible had happened. The Alpha had bled, and then, even more impossibly, had spared her. Why? Ilara stood and moved to the narrow window. It was too small to climb through, even if she weren't several stories above the ground. But it offered a view of the courtyard below, where she could see other vampires moving through the darkness. They moved with inhuman grace, their forms blurring at the edges when they moved quickly. She'd seen vampires before, of course. Everyone had. They ruled the northern territories absolutely, and their influence stretched even into the southern lands where she'd been born. But seeing them from a distance and being surrounded by them were entirely different experiences. The Alpha, Kalen Drev, she'd heard the others call him, was different even from his own kind. Taller, his presence more oppressive, his eyes more vivid. When he'd looked at her, Ilara had felt something beyond fear. Recognition, perhaps, as if he saw her not as prey or a thing, but as something that mattered. Probably her imagination, born of exhaustion and terror. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, realizing too late that she had no authority to grant permission. The door opened to reveal a vampire woman, the one called Seraphine, carrying a tray. The smell hit Ilara immediately. Warm bread, roasted meat, vegetables and butter. Real food. Her stomach clenched painfully. Seraphine set the tray on the table without a word, then turned to leave. "Wait," Ilara said. The vampire paused, her expression impassive. "Why is he doing this, the Alpha? Why am I alive?" "I don't know," Seraphine replied, her voice cool. "The Alpha's mind is his own, but if I were you, I wouldn't assume his mercy is permanent. He spared you tonight out of curiosity. When that curiosity is satisfied," she let the implication hang, "then I'll die." "Most likely." Seraphine's eyes, green, luminous in the dim light, studied her. "You're not afraid. Why?" Ilara considered lying, but decided against it. "I'm terrified. I just don't see the point in showing it." Something almost like respect flickered across Seraphine's features. "Eat. The Alpha will send for you when he's ready." She left, and Ilara was alone again. The food beckoned, and despite everything, she found herself sitting at the table. She told herself it was strategy. She'd need strength for whatever came next, but in truth, she was simply starving. The bread was still warm. The meat practically melted in her mouth. After weeks of gruel and moldy scraps, the meal tasted like something from a forgotten dream. Ilara ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware that it might be her last good meal. When she finished, exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. The bed looked impossibly inviting. She knew she should stay alert, should plan her next move, should do something other than surrender to sleep in a vampire stronghold. But her body had reached its limit. Ilara lay down on the bed, intending to rest for just a moment, and plummeted into darkness before she could form another thought. She dreamed of fire and blood, of her husband's face as the raiders tore out his throat, of the long march north in chains. But threaded through the nightmare were new images: the Alpha's crimson eyes, the shock on his face when her blade struck true, his voice commanding that she be spared. And underneath it all, a question that followed her even into sleep. What does a monster want with a woman who hurt him? Kaelin waited 3 days before summoning Ilara again. It was a calculated decision, designed to let her recover from her ordeal and, more importantly, to let her anticipation and fear build. In his experience, mortals in captivity went through predictable phases: initial terror, desperate hope, growing despair, and finally resignation. He wanted to see which phase Ilara Mirin would reach. The reports Seraphine brought him suggested something unexpected. Ilara hadn't wept or begged. She'd eaten the meals provided, slept when exhausted, and spent her waking hours staring out the window or pacing the room in measured patterns. Not the behavior of someone resigned to death, but of someone waiting. On the 3rd evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of blood and copper, Kaelin had her brought to his private study rather than the throne room. This was a space few ever saw, a circular chamber at the top of the fortress's highest tower, lined with books and artifacts collected over centuries. A fire burned in the hearth despite the mild weather, because Kaelin had learned that mortals found fire comforting. When the guards ushered Ilara inside, she took in the room with quick, intelligent eyes. She looked better than she had 3 nights ago. The hollows in her cheeks had filled slightly, and someone had provided her with a clean dress of dark blue wool, simple but well made. "Sit," Kaelin said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. He remained standing by the window, his back to her initially, allowing her to observe him in a context other than his throne. Elara sat, her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap. The firelight caught the dark brown of her hair, revealing threads of auburn he hadn't noticed before. "Do you know why I spared you?" Kaelin asked, still not turning around. "Curiosity," Elara replied without hesitation. "Your second-in-command said as much." Seraphine talks too much. Now he did turn, studying her face. "But she's not wrong. I am curious. About you specifically, but also about the audacity you displayed. Tell me, Elara Merrin, when you drove that blade into my chest, did you believe it would kill me?" She met his gaze. "No." "Then why do it?" "Because someone had to." Her voice was quiet but firm. "You stood there, telling your court that strength is yours alone, that mortals exist only to serve and fear you. And I realized that as long as we believe that, it becomes true. Someone had to show that you could bleed. Even if it changed nothing else, that truth needed to exist." Kaelin laughed, the sound genuine. "Changed nothing? You understand what you've done, don't you? 300 vampires watched you wound their alpha. Word is spreading through the Covenant. By now, every vampire in the Northern Territories knows that a mortal woman made me bleed. You've created a symbol, whether you intended to or not." "Good," Elara said simply. "Good." Kaelin moved closer, not threateningly, but with genuine interest. "You do realize that symbol makes you exceptionally dangerous to me. I should kill you simply to erase the memory of what you did." "Then why haven't you?" It was the question he'd been asking himself for 3 days. Kaelin settled into the chair opposite hers, the fire crackling between them. For a long moment, he simply studied her. This mortal woman who'd done the impossible with nothing but courage and a piece of iron. "Because," he said finally, "in 1,000 years, I've grown tired of strength, of power, of the endless certainty that I am, in all ways, superior." He leaned forward. "You surprised me, Elara Merrin, and surprise has become the rarest commodity in my existence. I want to understand how you did it. Not the physical mechanics. I know you got lucky with your strike. But how you found the courage when courage should have been impossible." Elara was quiet for a moment, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You want to know how a widow with nothing left to lose found the strength to attack a vampire king? I want to know how you looked at me, at what I am, and saw something that could be hurt. Because you're not what you pretend to be," Elara said. She leaned forward too, matching his posture. "You stand in that throne room and declare that strength is yours alone, that power is the only truth. But if that were really true, you wouldn't need to say it. You wouldn't need a court of 300 vampires sworn to you. You wouldn't need to inspire fear. Real power doesn't announce itself. It simply is." Kaelin felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries, the sting of being truly seen. This mortal woman, in chains and facing death, had identified the central paradox of his existence with casual precision. "Are you calling me weak?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "I'm calling you lonely," Elara replied, and the truth of it hit harder than her blade had. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the fire's whisper. Kaelin stood abruptly, moving to a table where a decanter of wine sat. He poured 2 glasses, an old habit from when he'd been mortal, though wine no longer affected him, and handed one to Elara. "You're either remarkably brave or remarkably stupid," he said. "Can't I be both?" Despite everything, Kaelin smiled. "Tell me about your life, before all this. Why do you care? Indulge me." Elara took a sip of wine, grimaced slightly at its strength, then set the glass down. I was born in the southern marches, in a village so small it didn't have a name. My father was a shepherd. My mother died when I was young. I married at 16, a farmer named Thomas, who was kind and boring and made me laugh. Her voice softened. We had 3 years together before your raiders came. They weren't raiders, Kaelin corrected. They were collectors. The Southern Territories owe tribute. Does it matter what you call them when the result is the same? Elara's eyes flashed. They burned our village, killed anyone who resisted, took the rest of us as slaves. Thomas tried to fight them. He had a pitchfork. They had fangs and centuries of experience. She looked away. It wasn't even close to a fair fight. No, Kaelin said quietly. It wouldn't have been. And now I'm here, alive when I should be dead, sitting across from the king of monsters, drinking wine that probably costs more than my village's annual harvest. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Tell me, Alpha, what happens next in this peculiar situation? Kaelin returned to his chair, cradling his own wineglass. That depends on you. On me? I'm going to make you a proposition, Ilara Mirin, one that will strike you as insane, possibly insulting, and definitely dangerous. He paused, but I think you'll accept it anyway. Ilara's expression grew wary. I'm listening. You've done something unprecedented. You've wounded me before my court and survived. That makes you a symbol, one that could inspire rebellion if handled poorly, or demonstrate my magnanimity if handled cleverly. He set down his glass. I want you to remain here, not as a prisoner, but as something else entirely. A slave with better accommodations? No. A consultant, perhaps, an advisor on mortal affairs. Ilara stared at him. You're joking? I never joke about power. Kaelin leaned back. The Northern Territories are becoming unstable. Mortals whisper of rebellion. My vassals grow restless. The Southern Territories are in chaos. I've ruled through fear and strength for 1,000 years, but I'm beginning to suspect that approach has limitations. He gestured at her. You demonstrated that. So here's my proposition. Stay here, learn about us, and teach me about you. About mortals? You've lived among us for 1,000 years. I've lived above you, Kaelin corrected. There's a difference. I've ruled mortals, fed on them, turned them into servants, but understanding them, that's something I've never tried. He held her gaze. Until now. Ilara stood, pacing toward the window. And if I refuse? Then you're free to leave. I'll give you supplies, a horse, and safe passage to the southern border. He paused. But we both know you won't make it far. The roads are dangerous. The villages are burning. And word of the woman who made the Alpha bleed is spreading. Someone will find you, one of my enemies or one of my allies, and use you for their own purposes. So it's a choice between a quick death out there or a slow one in here. Or it's a choice between dying meaninglessly or living purposefully. Kaelin stood as well. I'm offering you something unprecedented, Ilara. Power, of a sort. Influence. The chance to actually change things rather than just striking at them with iron. She turned to face him. Why? Why would you give a mortal that kind of access? Because I'm curious, he said again. Because I'm bored. Because in 1,000 years, no one has ever looked at me the way you did in that throne room. Not with hatred or worship, but with certainty that I could be challenged. He moved closer. And perhaps because you're right. Perhaps I am lonely. The admission hung between them, raw and unexpected. Ilara stood his face, searching for deception and finding only a strange, terrible honesty. If I agree, she said slowly, I have conditions. Naturally. I want access to information about what's happening in the Southern Territories. I want to know which villages have been destroyed, which mortals have been taken. Done. I want permission to speak freely, even when what I say is critical of you or your rule. Within reason. There is no within reason. Either I can speak freely or I can't. Kaelin's eyes narrowed. You're negotiating with a vampire who could kill you with a thought. Yes, Alara said calmly. And you're negotiating with a mortal who already made you bleed once. We both know what we're capable of. The silence stretched, tense as a drawn bowstring. Then Kaelin laughed, truly laughed with genuine delight. Fine, he said. Speak freely. I promise I'll only kill you if you're boring. Then we have an agreement. Alara held out her hand, a human gesture that seemed absurd given the circumstances. Kaelin looked at her hand, then at her face. Then, with deliberate ceremony, he took her hand in his. His skin was cool, the grip firm but not crushing. They shook once, formally, sealing a bargain that would have seemed impossible 3 days ago. I hope you understand what you've just committed to, Kaelin said, still holding her hand. I hope you understand the same, Alara replied. They stood there for a moment, hand in hand, mortal and vampire, bound now by something more complex than master and prisoner. Outside the window, night deepened over the Northern Territories, and in the fortress below, 300 vampires whispered about the woman who'd made their alpha bleed and lived. None of them could have guessed what would come next. Neither could Alara or Kaelin, if they were honest. But they'd both made their choice, and in that choice, the shape of the future began to shift. The news of Alara's new position spread through the fortress like wildfire through dry timber. Within hours, every vampire in Kaelin's covenant knew that the mortal woman who'd attacked their alpha was now residing in the East Wing. Not in a cell, but in chambers befitting a guest of status. Within a day, the whispers had reached the farthest corners of the Northern Territories. Reactions varied. Some saw it as proof of Kaelin's magnanimity, others viewed it as dangerous weakness. But all agreed on one thing. The Alpha's decision was unprecedented and would have consequences. Seraphine made her displeasure known the morning after the agreement, appearing in Kaelin's study while he reviewed reports from his vassals. "This is a mistake," she said without preamble, closing the door behind her. Kaelin didn't look up from the papers. "Your concerns are noted. My lord, the court is in an uproar. Lord Drasko is calling it an insult to the Covenant. Lady Morgaine suggests you've been enchanted. And the younger vampires," she paused, "the younger ones are questioning whether you've gone soft." "Let them question," Kaelin set down the papers. "The day my subjects stop questioning is the day they stop fearing. And fear, dear Seraphine, is what keeps an empire intact." "But giving power to a mortal?" "I'm not giving her power, I'm using her." Kaelin stood, moving to the window that overlooked the training yards. "That woman made me bleed in front of the entire court. The damage was done in that moment. Killing her afterward would have made it look like I feared her. Imprisoning her would have made her a martyr. But this turns a threat into a tool." Seraphine's expression remained skeptical. "You believe the court will accept that explanation?" "I believe the court will accept whatever I tell them to accept." His voice hardened. "But if you're concerned about appearances, arrange a demonstration. Something to remind everyone exactly who holds power here." "What kind of demonstration?" "Use your imagination." Kaelin turned from the window. "In the meantime, I need you to do something else. Find out everything you can about mortal resistance movements in the Southern Territories. Numbers, locations, leadership, everything. We have spies who handle that. Then coordinate with them. And Seraphine. He held her gaze. Whatever you think of my decision regarding Ilara Mirin, it stands. Challenge it again, and we'll have a different conversation. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Seraphine bowed her head. As you command, my lord. When she left, Kalen returned to his papers, that his mind was elsewhere. Seraphine wasn't wrong. His decision to keep Ilara close was dangerous, but danger, had found, was often the price of anything interesting. And Ilara Mirin was undeniably interesting. Ilara spent her first official day as the Alpha's consultant learning the layout of the fortress. She'd been assigned a guard, a young vampire named Corin who looked barely 20 but claimed to be 60 years old, and given permission to explore most of the stronghold. Most? She'd asked. The lower levels are forbidden, Corin explained as they walked through a corridor lined with ancient tapestries. That's where the blood stores are kept, and the Alpha's private chambers, and the vault where the really dangerous artifacts are locked away. What kind of artifacts? The kind that can kill vampires, Corin grinned, showing fangs. Ironically, we keep them because they're too dangerous to destroy. Old magic from when the world was younger and stranger. Ilara filed that information away. What about the library? Can I access that? The Alpha said you're to have access to anything that isn't explicitly forbidden. The library isn't forbidden. Corin led her through another turn. Though I should warn you, it's extensive. Thousands of books, some of them older than me. The library proved to be exactly as described. It occupied 3 full floors of the eastern tower, with shelves reaching toward vaulted ceilings and narrow windows admitting streams of dusty sunlight. The smell of old paper and leather bindings filled the air. Ilara stood at the entrance, momentarily overwhelmed. She'd learned to read from her mother, but their village had possessed perhaps a dozen books total. This was more knowledge than she'd imagined existed. I'll be outside if you need anything, Corin said, settling into a chair by the door. Ilara wandered deeper into the stacks, running her fingers along spines. History books, philosophy, ancient texts in languages she didn't recognize. An entire section devoted to vampire lore, which seemed almost narcissistic until she realized it was probably practical reference material. She found what she was looking for on the 3rd floor, maps. Dozens of them, ranging from simple sketches to elaborate cartographic works. Most focused on the northern territories, but several showed the broader continent, including the southern marches where she'd been born. Ilara spread one of the southern maps on a reading cable and studied it carefully. Villages were marked with small symbols. Some had been crossed out in red ink, destroyed or abandoned, she guessed. Others had notations in a language she didn't read. That's Vanik, a voice said behind her. The old tongue. Most vampires over 300 years old still use it for formal records. Ilara turned to find Kalen standing a few paces away. She hadn't heard him approach, which was unnerving. What do the notations say? She asked. Tribute status, population counts, resources. He moved to stand beside her, studying the map. This village here, he pointed to a mark near the southern border, supplied grain. This one provided livestock. This one, he paused. This one was burned 2 months ago for refusing tribute. Ilara's throat tightened. That's Millbrook. My cousin lived there. I'm sorry. Are you? She looked at him. You ordered it, didn't you? Or at least you allowed it. I allowed it, Kalen confirmed. A village refusing tribute is a village inviting others to do the same. Examples must be made. Examples. Ilara's hands clenched into fists. Is that what you call murdering farmers? Examples? I call it maintaining order. His voice remained calm. You find it cruel, I find it necessary. That's the fundamental difference between us. The fundamental difference is that you have the power to destroy, and I have to watch. No. Kalen's eyes fixed on hers. The fundamental difference is that I accepted the burden of power, and you rejected it. But you're here now, Ilara, so tell me, what would you have done differently? I would have. She stopped, because she didn't know. How did you rule without fear? How did you maintain control without violence? She'd never had to consider it before. Precisely, Kalen said, reading her hesitation. It's easy to condemn from powerlessness, much harder to choose mercy when you're responsible for thousands of lives, mortal and immortal alike. Ilara turned back to the map. If I'm to advise you on mortal affairs, I need to understand the full scope. Show me where the resistance is strongest, so you can help them? So I can help you understand them. She met his gaze. That was the agreement, wasn't it? I teach you about mortals, you give me access to information. Unless you were lying. I never lie, Kalen said. Lying is for creatures who fear the truth. He reached past her and pulled out another map, this one marked with different symbols, red clusters scattered across the southern territories. These are confirmed resistance cells, he explained. Some are former soldiers, some are just farmers with pitchforks and anger. Most don't last long. My vassals hunt them down, but some do last. Yes, these 3 in particular. He pointed to 3 larger red marks. Organized, well-led. They've managed to raid supply lines and even destroy 2 of my vassals' strongholds in the past year. Ilara studied the locations. One was near her home village, or what had been her home village. Do you know who leads them? We have names. Whether they're real names is another question. Kalen traced a line connecting the 3 strongholds. What's interesting is the coordination. These groups are separated by hundreds of miles, yet they strike in patterns. Someone is organizing them. And you want me to help you find out who? Eventually. He rolled up the map. But first, I want you to understand something crucial. I don't need your help hunting mortals. I have 3 centuries of vampires perfectly capable of that. What I need is your perspective on why they fight when fighting is hopeless. What drives mortals to resistance when resistance equals death? Ilara was quiet for a moment, considering whether to answer honestly. Then she decided that honesty was the only currency worth trading here. Hope, she said simply. Even false hope is better than accepting that you're cattle. But you are cattle, Kalen said. Not cruelly, but as if stating an obvious fact. Mortals live brief lives, weak and fragile. Vampires are stronger, faster, virtually immortal. The natural order. There is no natural order, Ilara interrupted. There's only the order that power creates. And power changes. Empires fall. Kings die. Even vampires, I imagine, can be destroyed. Careful, Kalen warned. But there was amusement in his voice. That sounds dangerously close to sedition. You gave me permission to speak freely. So I did. He gestured toward the door. Come. If you're going to advise me on mortal affairs, you should see how those affairs are currently managed. There's a court session this evening. You'll attend as my guest. What kind of session? The kind where I dispense justice. Vampires bring their disputes, and I settle them. He paused at the doorway. And occasionally, mortals are involved. I think you'll find it educational. The throne room was even more imposing at night, lit by hundreds of candles that cast flickering shadows across the stone walls. Ilara stood to the right of Kalen's throne, positioned where she could observe without being the focus of attention. The vampires who filed in to present their cases barely glanced at her, though she felt the weight of their awareness. She was the anomaly, the mortal who'd wounded their alpha and somehow survived. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with contempt, a few with something that might have been calculation. The first 3 cases were purely vampire concerns: a dispute over territory, an accusation of treachery, a petition to expand hunting grounds. Kaelin handled each with efficient brutality, rendering judgments that seemed to satisfy no one completely, but that everyone accepted without question. Then Seraphine announced the 4th petitioner, Lord Vex of the Eastern Marches, presenting a matter of blood debt. A vampire Ilara hadn't seen before strode into the throne room, dragging a mortal man in chains behind him. The man was young, perhaps 25, with the build of a laborer and bruises covering his face. "My Lord Alpha," Vex said, bowing precisely, "I bring before you a mortal who owes me a blood debt. 3 months ago, this creature's brother killed one of my fledglings during a raid. The brother died in the fighting, but according to the old laws, blood debt transfers to kin." Kaelin leaned forward slightly. "And what do you seek?" "Permission to take his life in payment, or, if you're feeling merciful, permission to turn him. Either satisfies the debt." The mortal, the young man, finally looked up, his eyes finding Ilara's. There was terror there, but also desperate hope, as if he thought she might somehow help him. Ilara looked at Kaelin, who seemed to be considering the petition. The silence stretched. "What say you?" Kaelin asked, and it took Ilara a moment to realize he was addressing her, not Lord Vex. Every eye in the throne room turned to her. Ilara felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her voice steady. "You're asking me? You're my consultant on mortal affairs. This seems relevant. Lord Vex has invoked an old law. Is it just?" It was a test. Ilara understood that immediately. How she answered would define her role here, would determine whether she was truly an advisor or merely a decoration. She looked at the young man in chains, then at Lord Vex, then at Kaelin. "The law is old," she said carefully, "but old doesn't mean just. This man didn't kill your fledgling. His brother did. Punishing him for his brother's actions doesn't serve justice. It serves revenge." Murmurs rippled through the assembled vampires. Lord Vex's eyes narrowed dangerously. "The mortal dares to question our laws?" he hissed. "The mortal dares to answer a question her alpha asked," Ilara shot back. "Or would you prefer I stay silent and decorative?" More murmurs, these more uncertain. Kaelin raised a hand, and silence fell immediately. "Continue," he said to Ilara. "If the concern is blood debt," Ilara said, "then consider what killing this man accomplishes. You lose a potential worker. His family loses a son and brother. The other mortals see that vampire justice punishes the innocent along with the guilty. How does any of that strengthen your rule?" "It demonstrates that we are not to be trifled with," Lord Vex argued. "It demonstrates that you're afraid," Ilara countered. "Why else would you need to kill someone who poses no threat to you?" The throne room erupted in angry whispers. Several vampires moved as if to approach her, but Kaelin's voice cut through the chaos. "Enough." Instant silence. Kaelin stood, descending the steps of his throne with deliberate slowness. He approached Lord Vex, ignoring the mortal in chains. "Lord Vex," he said quietly, "do you believe the mortal woman speaks from ignorance or from insight?" Lord Vex's jaw clenched. "Ignorance, my lord. She doesn't understand our ways." Perhaps, Kaelin turned to Ilara, or perhaps she sees something we've overlooked in our centuries of following tradition without questioning it. He looked back at Vex. Your blood debt is acknowledged, but I'm commuting the sentence. The mortal will serve you for 1 year as indentured labor. At the end of that year, the debt is satisfied, and he goes free. My lord, Vex began, do you question my judgment? The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Lord Vex bowed his head immediately. Never, my lord. Your wisdom is absolute. Good. Take your new servant and go. Vex grabbed the chained mortal and dragged him from the throne room, shooting Ilara a look of pure venom as he passed. Ilara met his gaze evenly, though her heart hammered in her chest. When the throne room had emptied, Kaelin returned to his throne and regarded Ilara with an expression she couldn't quite read. You've made an enemy, he observed. I was already surrounded by enemies. What's one more? Lord Vex is old and vindictive. He'll wait for an opportunity to make you regret embarrassing him. Then I'll have to avoid giving him opportunities. Ilara moved closer to the throne. Was that truly a test, or did you expect me to stay silent? I expected you to do exactly what you did, Kaelin said. Challenge convention. Force me to reconsider old patterns. That's why you're here, after all. And did you commute the sentence because you agreed with my reasoning, or because you wanted to demonstrate your power? Kaelin smiled. Can't it be both? Before Ilara could respond, Seraphine appeared in the doorway. My lord, urgent news from the Southern Territories. Raiders have attacked the garrison at Blackwood Crossing. Kaelin's expression hardened. Casualties? 12 vampires dead. The garrison commander is missing, presumed taken or destroyed. Blackwood Crossing is one of our strongest positions. Kaelin stood. If it's been compromised, there's more, Seraphine interrupted, which Ilara realized was a significant breach of protocol. The raiders left a message, carved into the garrison walls. What did it say? Seraphine's eyes flicked to Ilara, then back to Kaelin. It said, "The woman showed us you can bleed. Now we'll show you that you can die." The silence that followed was absolute and terrible. Kaelin's expression didn't change, but Ilara felt the atmosphere in the room shift as if the air itself had become denser. When he spoke, his voice was soft and infinitely more dangerous than any shout. Assemble the War Council. We meet in 1 hour. He looked at Ilara. You should return to your chambers. No, Ilara said, surprising herself. If this is connected to what I did, I should be part of the discussion. This is vampire business. This is mortal rebellion inspired by a mortal action, Ilara interrupted. You wanted my perspective on why mortals fight. Well, here's your answer. They fight because I showed them it's possible. Kaelin studied her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded. Very well. You'll attend the War Council. But understand this, Ilara. If you're in that room, you're complicit in whatever decisions we make. Whatever blood is spilled, whatever villages burn, you'll bear part of that responsibility. I understand. Do you? Because once you cross this line, there's no pretending you're just a victim of circumstance. You become a participant in this war. Ilara thought of the young man she'd just helped save and of the message carved into the garrison walls. She thought of her dead husband and her burned village and all the other mortals suffering under vampire rule. And she thought of the impossible position she now occupied, close enough to power to maybe, possibly, change something. I'm already a participant, she said. I became one the moment I drove that blade into your chest. So yes, I'll attend your war council, and I'll give you my honest counsel, even if you don't like what I have to say." Kalen's smile was sharp as a blade. "I would expect nothing less. Come then, consultant. Let's see if you can stomach the reality of power." The War Council convened in a chamber deep within the fortress, around a table carved from a single massive piece of timber. Maps covered its surface, held down by daggers and ornate weights. 15 vampires gathered around it, Kalen's most trusted generals and advisors, including Seraphine. Ilara was the only mortal present, a fact that wasn't lost on anyone. She stood behind Kalen's chair, trying to make herself as unobtrusive as possible while still being able to see and hear everything. "Blackwood Crossing is not a minor garrison," began Lord Drasko, the ancient vampire who'd questioned Kalen's decision to spare Ilara. "It's a strategic stronghold, controlling 3 major supply routes. If mortals can destroy it, nowhere in the Southern Territories is safe." "Do we know how many raiders participated?" asked Lady Morgaine, a striking vampire with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice. "Estimates range from 50 to 100, Seraphine reported. "They attacked at dawn when our forces were at their weakest. Coordinated assault, military precision." "Former soldiers, then," Kalen mused, studying the map. "Not farmers with pitchforks." "The resistance has been recruiting," another general added, "offering protection to refugees, food to the starving, in exchange for loyalty. And they're using what happened here as propaganda," Lord Drasko said, his gaze sliding to Ilara, "the woman who made the Alpha bleed." The attention in the room shifted to Ilara like the focus of a predator. She felt her skin prickle but refused to look away. "Then we kill the symbol?" Lord Vex suggested. He was present at the council, Ilara realized, which meant he held more power than she'd thought. "Execute the mortal publicly. Send her head to the resistance leaders. Show them what happens to symbols." Several vampires voiced agreement. Ilara's hand moved unconsciously to her throat. "No," Kalen said flatly. "My lord, you must see the logic," Lord Vex began. "I said no." Kalen's voice carried absolute finality. "Killing Ilara Mirren now would confirm every story the Resistance is telling. It would make her a martyr and prove that we fear her influence. Instead, we turn the narrative." "How?" Seraphine asked. Kalen leaned back, his fingers steepled. "The Resistance thinks they understand what happened here. A brave mortal woman struck a blow against the Vampire King. They're wrong. What actually happened is that a mortal attacked me in a moment of desperation, and I was so utterly unthreatened that I not only spared her, but elevated her to a position of influence." "You want to use her as propaganda," Lady Morgaine said slowly. "Show that even those who attack you end up serving you." "Precisely. But it has to be genuine. Forced compliance would be obvious." Kalen glanced at Ilara. "Which is why I'm going to ask our consultant what she thinks we should do about Blackwood Crossing." Every vampire in the room turned to stare at Ilara. She felt the weight of their attention, their skepticism, their anger. But she also felt Kalen's expectation. He genuinely wanted her answer. "You're asking me how to respond to a mortal rebellion?" she said carefully. "I'm asking you how to end it with minimal casualties. You could start by asking why they're rebelling." "We know why," Lord Drasko snapped. "They're cattle who've forgotten their place." "No," Ilara said, her voice steady despite her fear. "They're people who've been pushed beyond endurance. You take their food, their children, their blood. You rule through terror, and then you're surprised when terror breeds resistance? We rule as we must, Seraphine said. Mortals are mortal, yes, weak and fragile and brief, Alara cut her off. I've heard it before, but here's what you don't seem to understand. Even fragile things can be dangerous when they have nothing left to lose. That's what you're seeing at Blackwood Crossing, not soldiers. Not warriors, just people who decided that death fighting is better than death kneeling. The silence was profound. Then Kaelin spoke. So how do we address that? Ilara moved closer to the table, studying the map. Her hands shook slightly, but she clasped them together. You give them something to lose again. Not much, you won't convince them to love you, but maybe enough that resistance seems less appealing than survival. You're suggesting we negotiate with rebels? Lord Vex said incredulously. I'm suggesting you separate the rebels from the people supporting them. Ilara pointed to the area around Blackwood Crossing. These villages here, they're providing food and shelter to the resistance, not because they love rebels, but because the rebels offer protection. Change that calculation. How? Kaelin asked, genuinely curious. Reduce the tribute. Not everywhere, that would look like weakness, but in key areas. Make it known that cooperation brings leniency, that resistance brings destruction, but compliance brings relief. She met Kaelin's eyes. And then you keep that promise, because if you lie, you'll only create more rebels. This is absurd, Lord Drasko declared. We should be increasing pressure, not decreasing it. Burn every village that supports the rebels. Make the price of rebellion so high. That every mortal in the south takes up arms? Ilara interrupted, because that's what you'll get. You can't kill everyone. There are thousands of mortals for every vampire. Right now, most of them are too scared or too exhausted to fight, but push them far enough, and even fear stops working. She's right, Lady Morgaine said quietly. Everyone turned to stare at her. What? She is. We've been escalating for years. More tribute, harsher punishments, greater shows of force, and the resistance keeps growing. Perhaps it's time to try something different. Something different? Lord Vex practically spat the words. You want to show weakness because a mortal woman says we should? I want to win, Lady Morgaine replied coolly. And winning isn't always about crushing your enemies. Sometimes it's about making them stop wanting to be your enemies. The debate raged for another hour, vampires arguing among themselves while Ilara stood silent, watching. She was fascinated by the dynamics. The way Kaelin allowed the argument to flow, only occasionally steering it with a question or observation. This was power too, she realized. Not the power of absolute command, but the power of letting others believe they had agency while ultimately shaping every decision. Finally, Kaelin raised his hand, and the room fell silent. Here's what we're going to do, he said. Morgaine, you'll take a force to the villages surrounding Blackwood Crossing. Offer reduced tribute in exchange for intelligence on the resistance. No reprisals against villages that accept. And those that refuse? Morgaine asked. Give them one chance to reconsider. If they still refuse, he paused, then Drasko's forces will demonstrate why cooperation is preferable. But only to those who actively side with the resistance. No wholesale slaughter. Lord Drasko looked unhappy but nodded. As for Blackwood Crossing itself, Kaelin continued, we retake it, but we do it carefully. I want resistance leaders captured alive if possible. Dead rebels can't tell us who's organizing this movement. And if they won't surrender? Seraphine asked. Then we remind them why challenging us is futile. Kalen's eyes glowed briefly, a reminder of the inhuman power he contained. But we offer the option first. Elara is right about one thing. People with nothing to lose are dangerous, so we give them something to lose. He stood, effectively ending the council. Prepare your forces. We move at sunset tomorrow. Dismissed. The vampires filed out, some casting dark looks at Elara as they passed. When the room had emptied except for Kalen and Seraphine, Elara finally allowed herself to breathe deeply. That, Seraphine said to Kalen, was either brilliant or catastrophically stupid. I haven't decided which yet. Time will tell, Kalen replied. He looked at Elara. You did well. I gave you advice that might get more mortals killed. You gave me advice that might end this conflict before thousands more die on both sides. He moved toward the door. Come, you look exhausted. As they walked through the corridors, Elara's mind raced. She'd just helped plan a military operation against her own people, had advised the Alpha on how to more effectively suppress the very resistance that had been inspired by her actions. Was this collaboration? Or was it something else? A chance to minimize the damage, to save lives, even while serving a vampire king? You're quiet, Kalen observed, as they climbed the stairs toward the residential levels. I'm thinking. About? About whether I just betrayed everyone I should be loyal to. Kalen paused at a landing, turning to face her. Loyalty is more complicated than you imagine. You think you should be loyal to mortals because you are one, but mortals aren't a unified group. Some want peace, some want revenge, some just want to survive. He resumed walking. You gave counsel that might prevent wholesale slaughter. That's not betrayal. That's pragmatism.